I'm Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, You Shall Have No Other Gods, the book of Exodus. Today we'll be talking about lesson 4 of our study, which covers the book of Exodus, chapter 4. In the previous lesson, Moses met God, and God laid out the broad strokes of a plan for how he was going to deliver the Israelites from captivity in Egypt. In this lesson, we get to Moses' response to God's plan. They go back and forth on some logistical details. God makes a few concessions and adjustments to the original plan that are very not optimal in the future, and we'll talk about that. They have long-standing implications for the priesthood and bad ones. We'll talk about that. And then Moses finally and God reach an agreement about a workable version of the plan that Moses is willing to do. Then Moses sets out, and it seems like he skipped something. And God is not a happy camper as he sets out along the way, and they have one last little detail to sort through before the whole thing comes apart. This further builds on the idea of this being a model of prayer, right? Like, we talked about how do you start that initial connection with God that leads to the conversation, then listening instead of talking to God to figure out what he wants. Now we're to the more detailed voicing of your concerns part of that, which is allowable, but note that in general, Moses is still going to end up doing what God suggested. But God does make some accommodation in his plan for what Moses is comfortable with and willing to do. And then Moses goes to do what he's been asked. It is worth, at this point, starting to set up a bit of an idea of a comparison. There was, once upon a time, somebody that God came to who was content in his life at home tending flocks, and said, I want you to go over there and be there instead of here and to serve me. And Abram said, great, I'm in, and did that. And it's on that basis that there are Hebrews and Israelites, and that they're in Egypt, and that this is a thing. It was the start of all of this in the form that it's in. There are comparisons here between Moses and Abram that we'll make more later. We're privy to the conversation that Moses has with God, and we're not privy to the one that Abram does, right? Which would be a great conversation to be able to witness. Because, first of all, Moses gets a really handy shorthand when God says, I'm the God of Abraham. That wouldn't have worked so well if God showed up to Abram and said, I'm the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Abram would have said, who? That's not helpful. So they had to, in some other way, establish relationship, and we're not privy to how that happened. But, like Moses, Abram had a life-changing encounter with God. Like Moses, he bought into God's plan, and he went when God said to go. And things happened as a result of that. Unlike Moses, we never see any sign of Abram being reluctant or holding anything back. That's like Abram's defining characteristic, right? He does not hold anything back from God. And as such, he is the father of our faith, even ours still now, because he didn't hold anything back from God. As we're drawing some comparisons here, remember, Moses is brand new in his relationship with God. He's not the Moses that gives the 10 Commandments, or that leads the people right up to the threshold of the Promised Land, right? He's not there yet. He's not all in yet at this point, which we'll see. And that comparison matters. Because God basically needs Moses to be another Abram, to be all in, or this doesn't work. And so that's really what we're ironing out in this lesson, is God is kind of speeding Moses into getting close enough to all in that he can make this whole thing work. So we will see how the various parts of that exchange go. Moses' objection, the first, and not the only. But behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, the Lord did not appear to you. On a scale of not at all valid to Moses, you raise a good point, where do you think this one falls? I think this is a decent one, but it comes up due to Moses still not understanding who God is, right? Like, this is a very human concern. God has said, I'm going to act mightily against the Egyptians. They're going to let you leave Egypt, and they're going to give you a bunch of stuff along the way. And Moses' problem isn't with any of that happening. It's just, they're not going to believe me. This is kind of a self-pitying form of objection, right? This is Moses still not having a good sense of himself. And he's imposing upon God his own insecurities with himself, right? I'm sure he's the only person in history who's ever done that. And none of us ever get caught up in doing that, right? But that's the important note here, right? There's so much that's profound psychologically in the book of Exodus. This is one of those things where Moses is casting his own securities onto God. He's not doubting the bigger, like, crazier things God wants to do. The only thing God wants to do that Moses it all doubts is the part where Moses is doing it. The rest of it, he's like, oh, the stuff that just you, God, are doing, yeah, no problem. That's all. That's definitely going to happen. No problem. But the stuff that you think I'm going to execute on, have you met me? I don't think that's going to go so well. What do you think about that? And interestingly, I think these signs that God gives to Moses to do, note that this is not the kind of sign like when you have delivered the Israelites from Egypt, you'll come back and worship at the base of this mountain. That's how you'll know that I, God, am really doing this. That's like the proof kind of sign. This is also that, but it's not. This is a very different in character thing, right? This is first the sign, right? So Moses, you happen to be holding a staff. Throw it on the ground. Oh, it's a snake. And Moses is afraid of it, even though God's right there. And, you know, that this again shows where Moses' head is at. That, like, he'd be afraid of a snake, but now he's afraid of his staff that's a snake when God is there with him and clearly made it happen, right? Like, this, it's not rational to be afraid here like it would be if it were just a snake that he ran into. And God says, oh yeah, don't worry about it. Just pick it up and it'll be fine. And it's staff again. Who is that sign for? Right? It's purportedly for Moses to prove to people that he's speaking for God. What it really does is it gives Moses some degree of confidence, right? It's a thing he can do. And when he can feel like, okay, now with this up my sleeve, I'll come back to that joke. With this ready at hand to do, they'll be okay with me because it's not just me now, right? I've got something flashy to distract from me. The ironic part of this, and all of these things, all of these concessions that God is making and don't end up mattering, right? Like this one, Moses does the snake thing and Pharaoh's like, we can do that, and doesn't care at all, right? It doesn't do anything. It's irrelevant, right? Also, we don't see that he does it for the Israelites, who seem to be the ones that he's still worried about, right? God has already said, you're just going to go, you're going to tell them my name, and they're going to accept you. We don't get a lot of the details of that conversation in the book of Exodus, but it seems like that sort of is what happens. Maybe it's just because they're more than happy to have a scapegoat go to Pharaoh on their behalf, and they think, oh yeah, this will be funny. He can voice our concerns. Maybe Pharaoh will say, yeah, we'll let you go worship for 3 days and something good will happen. And if, he doesn't and he kills somebody, it's going to be this guy. So Moses, yeah, go for it. It's hard to say, again, the psychology of everything that's going on, but we don't see him actually do the same thing in Exodus until he's around Pharaoh. And at that point, it is unnecessary, right? So Moses, objection number one, God responds with the thing that is, as it turns out, pointless to everyone but Moses. So it seems, but it gives Moses some confidence. So far, so good. We've one objection, one answer. So, snakes are good and all. We're feeling good about that one. Moses, you seem like you're still a little apprehensive. How about this? Sign 2. You've got a hand. You've got a robe. Now your hand is leprous. Now it's not. If the snake one doesn't work, that one will totally work. God is doing things that bolster Moses' confidence and otherwise have no bearing on God's plan at all, which is kind of funny, actually. But also helpful for Moses, right? Like, he clearly has a lot of self-confidence issues at this point, and these things are making him feel better about what he's about to go do. They're negotiating, right? Moses is stating his concerns. God is addressing them in a way that has no bearing on his greater plan. Win-win. Okay, 2 signs are good. 3 signs are better. In case those don't work, we've got this other thing where we can turn, just a little bit of water from the Nile into blood, or all of it, but a little bit we can do. We'll get to that. This one has more of an impact, but it's because the way God does this isn't exactly as described or as advertised, right? This becomes the first plague, and it's like all the water in the land and not like a cup of water from the Nile poured onto dry ground. God really turns this one up to 11 when it gets to this point, which we will see. And that really kicks off the next phase. So God gives Moses a sign, but it turns out to be the first plague. Again, thing God intended to do anyway. So win-win, good negotiating. A bit more of a serious note about these signs. There's a common thread in what they mean, right? And what that is God's power over life, death, sin, purity, all of those things, right? Like snake. Last seen in the Bible, or first seen in the Bible. There might have been one somewhere between. I'm not aware of one. Famously seen before this event in the Bible, at any rate, in the garden, right? Being the cause of temptation that ultimately didn't cause but led Eve and then Adam to sin and to die. Moses here, acting on behalf of God. The relevant part of these signs isn't when they're in two parts isn't making your hand leprous, it's making it not leprous, right? Like anybody can get turned leprous, right? Like that's not miraculous. The speed at which it happens is, but the miraculous thing is it can become not leprous, right? So you need a snake to demonstrate your power over snakes. So your staff becomes a convenient snake. So you can, right, the staff turning into the snake is the part that we think is cool. But the relevant and meaningful part of the sign is this is not unlike, and I will put enmity between you and the woman, right? He will strike at your heels and you will strike in the, you know, I'm misquoting it, but the seed of the woman striking at the snake's head versus the snake striking at his heel, right? Like, and this is like, hey, Moses, you can just reach out and pick it up. That snake doesn't, like he sees it and it's, snake. And then God's like, yeah, that's no problem for you. Just pick it up. And he does. What power does that temptation to sin have over Moses? You just pick it up and turn it into a snake or a staff. What power does uncleanliness, that again is associated with as an effect of sin, have on Moses? Not much. He has complete power over that. What about the Nile? So, water in the Bible can mean life and it can mean death. And in some rare instances, a famous one of which is in this book, it can mean both of those at the same time. Or in baptism, it means both of those at the same time. Water is not life itself, though, right? Even when it's a symbol of life, it's because water is a thing that gives life. That's helpful. It's not life, though. The thing that is life is blood. That's why after the flood, God says, okay, you all can eat animals, but you can't eat their blood, because that's their life, and that's the thing that's sacred to me, their lifeblood. Like that represents the life that's been given by God. So God can take something that, while it helps support life and is neat enough, he can take that and make life itself out of water, right? Like that's the idea. So a thing that is inert and not alive can, just pour it out on the ground and it can become life. That's how easy life is for God, right? Like he has absolute power over temptation, over corruption and uncleanness, and he can make life from nothing. These are powerful signs, right? Like I will make some light of them later as Pharaoh's magicians are mimicking some of these things, but the core idea of these signs is profound, right? And shows something important about God and something important about Moses, right? Moses is able to carry out these things. That is not a small deal at all. There are not many people in the Bible that God gives power over life and death. There's eventually Jesus. There's pretty obviously Elisha. And everything else is a much grayer area between here and there. It's a short list. And it's a big deal. And a good foundation upon which to build the law, right? This guy who's going to legislate has the ability to mitigate the effects of sin and to bring life from death. Like that's what the law is trying to do, right? The law is the real sign here. That these things are like foreshadowing, but what Moses does later is the thing that really does what these are basically cheap parlor trick versions of. As again, we'll see a little later. And they're not that relevant, right? Like they give Moses confidence, but they don't really matter beyond that. Moses' objection number 2. So on this basis, and I don't think it's a very good reading of the text, people sometimes say that Moses has a stutter. What he's saying here, though, is I'm not eloquent, right? Like I I'm slow of speech. Like, I can't think and speak well and articulately, right? Not, I stutter, like I'm stupid and get nervous speaking in public, right? Like, that seems way more to be the case of what he's going for. And again, that's discounting that God's involved, right? It's like, oh, it's about me, God, and I can't speak in public. So find somebody eloquent who can speak in public, because, that matters so much when Pharaoh's going to say no to whatever he asks, right? You better be able to ask it eloquently so he doesn't say no. We know he's, anyway, Moses is coming around, right? But objection 2. And God says, who made your mouth? Who makes people able or disabled? Don't worry, I've got you. Like, this should not be a concern. I'm all over it. And I'll tell you what to say, so you don't have to worry about it. That, on the scale of good objection to bad objection from Moses' side of things, that's a bad objection. God's initial response is, just don't worry about it. It'll be fine. This one Moses isn't buying. So objection to the 3rd. No, really, send somebody else. Doubling down on the, it's not enough that you'll tell me what to say thing. Like, I bad at public speaking, can't do it. And then God is legitimately angry. And he says, okay, your brother, Aaron, that you haven't seen for a long time and that you didn't grow up with anyway. He's your brother though, right? And he's a Levite. My God, no, he's a great speaker. And, it just so happens he's coming out here to meet you. And he'll be happy to see you. So, here's what we're going to do. You will tell him what to say, and then he will say it. That's easy enough, right? The ironic and hilarious thing about that, Moses' objection is he's slow of speech and doesn't know what to say. And he's not okay with that. As soon as it's, you tell him what to say and he'll say it, Moses is fine, but the words are still coming from Moses, who thinks he can't speak, right? This is just a safety blanket to deal with Moses' insecurity. And beyond that, we see Moses gets really tired of this arrangement and starts speaking to Pharaoh directly, pretty fast. So, like, this whole thing is, it's not needed, it doesn't work well, and it does another thing. Aaron becomes the first priest, and priests descend from all Levites, but especially from the line of Aaron. The Levites have their own special role, and we'll see, but priests are from the line of Aaron. And the high priest is like the oldest, the senior person in that line, first of which is Aaron. Moses is not a priest. And you have then extra layers of, like, Moses is already the mediator between God and humanity. Priests are supposed to be the mediator between God and humanity. Moses is supposed to be the priest, but he abdicates what God is trying to get him to do, and we get this other guy involved. That Moses will be like God to Aaron, and Aaron will be like Moses to Moses. So you're adding another layer. The problem is Aaron doesn't have the relationship with God. At best, he has the relationship with Moses. And when Moses isn't around, he doesn't even have that. This creates an inherent problem that characterizes the priesthood, right? They don't have a direct relationship with God, and they're meant to mediate between God and people. And they're always going through what is present that Moses leaves, but they never have a direct relationship. So they're always going through the law and the things left by Moses, and they never are going directly to God, because Aaron never did. And that creates all manner of problems, and isn't righted until we have a new priest who does go directly to God because he is God. But if Moses had just plucked up the guts here and done this himself, it could have potentially been a very different thing and a better thing. This is the accommodation God makes that does matter. It doesn't matter in what happens with Pharaoh, because Moses starts speaking pretty quickly instead of Aaron, and Pharaoh says no the first 9.5 times anyway. Aaron contributes nothing to the immediate task at hand, but then he's around in a role that has been given authority after that. And things go through and from Aaron, who was, he's neither an elected official nor is he one really chosen by God, right? He's chosen because God needs somebody to make Moses feel okay. And that's the best that he can do. And that's a poor foundation for a priesthood. So we have problems that arise from this it'll come up again at least one very famous time in Exodus. But the long-standing ramifications of this don't even come up in Exodus. But if you're reading later in the Bible and you're seeing, oh, this priesthood isn't going that well, remember this, and this is why, right? It gets off on the wrong foot and with the wrong foundation, and the later problems are fairly easily attributable to what happens right here. With those 3 objections answered, it seems Moses has run out of excuses and has decided, okay, I guess I have to do this. So he goes back home and tells his father-in-law, I guess I have to go back. So, I met God and we had this conversation. He doesn't really say, you presume he must have said that, but it's not in the text. Jethro gives him his blessing to go back. Nobody's going to try to kill you anyway. So Moses takes his wife and his sons and is ready to go back to Egypt. This seems unnecessary at first, that God is reiterating what they just agreed to, right? They just had this exchange and they agreed to the plan and, what Moses was going to say and do before Pharaoh and how that was going to go, and that he wasn't going to listen. All of that is a repeat of their conversation. So why is this here? It's here for this other part. Thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son. And I say to you, let my son go that he may serve me. If you refuse to let him go, behold, I will slay your firstborn son. This is, the later half of this is foreshadowing, of course, of the last plague that actually allows the Egyptians to go. But more than that, we see something to do with firstborn sons coming up that is going to matter a lot. It's how God conceives of his people and his relationship with them at this point. It's a long time before we see a lot of really regular imagery about God's people being his family again, right? This isn't the most common Old Testament image. It's a very common New Testament image. It's the New Testament image. It's a lot less common here. But it tells us a lot about how God really views his people and his view of the responsibilities of family. He has to let his people go because they're his, and they're his son, and they're marked as such. There are rules about that. that make him such. And if Pharaoh opposes God's son, then God will oppose Pharaoh's son. And it's going to be a fair exchange. There's something about firstborn sons that in this context is critically important to God. And that's been a theme with his people since back at Abraham. So that is a big deal. And it's about to be a big deal in a different way. This is a transition point into another thing. That's what is the thing that really matters about it. We'll see that shortly. This is one of those passages that can easily seem very confusing and out of place. God just had this lengthy negotiation with Moses to get Moses to go to talk to Pharaoh, made a number of concessions, granted some signs, got Moses on board. Moses is ready to go, and now God is like, no, I'm going to kill you. This is not okay. What happened? This is where the comparison between Moses and Abraham is so important, right? God told Abraham to go, and Abraham went, and he held nothing back, right? He went with no sign of hesitation when he was told to go. Certainly not bargaining in a series of concessions. He listened to and dedicated himself entirely to everything God gave him to do. His one complaint, and he didn't even complain about it, was that he didn't have a son, and he wanted one, by his beloved wife, Sarah. And God said, yep, cool, we can do that. Son. He made a covenant with Abraham, gave him the sign of circumcision to mark Abraham, all of his people, and eventually his son Isaac as belonging to God, which they again did without hesitation. And then God said, hey, that son that you love so much that I gave to you, it's my son, right? You should sacrifice him to me. And Abraham said, yep, okay, I'll do that. And was ready to do that. Because he agreed, this is your son. Absolutely, it's your son. If that's what you want, I guess that's what we're doing, because your son. Great. Moses, by contrast, God says, hey, you should go do a thing I'm telling you. Moses says, yeah, not me though. And not like that. And not this way. And are you sure? And maybe not. And they have to have a lengthy argument about it. Comparison. Abram good. Moses not all in yet. God gave to Abram the sign of circumcision. He circumcised himself, everyone in his household, and of course his son. Moses was clearly a Hebrew. Pharaoh's daughter recognized him as such because he was circumcised. Moses' parents circumcised him. When Moses left everything behind, seems like he didn't circumcise, doesn't seem like he did not circumcise his firstborn son, marking that child as belonging to God. He held his son back from God. And then he is supposed to care for God's son when he has held his son back from God. What did Abram do again? Oh yeah, he said, my son is your son, God, and as is mine, so is yours. Moses said, no, my son, keeping my son, we'll go take care of yours, God, but how can he be qualified to care for God's son when he's holding his own back? Which his wife recognizes and resolves. But therein lies the mortal peril that Moses is in, right? He cannot be in the role that God is putting him in when he's holding things back from God. It is mortally perilous to attempt to do so. As we see, it's not like God is contriving to go through all these steps just to kill Moses. It's Moses is drawing closer to God in doing this thing, And in accepting service of God, he has accepted greater accountability than he had, right? Like some random sheep farmer in Midian, minimal accountability for not circumcising his son. The sole person responsible for delivering all of God's people from slavery in Egypt. Massive accountability if he hasn't circumcised his own son. Like, can't do that. You die for that. So his changing relationship with God moves him into a greater sphere of accountability. And so a thing that was not a problem becomes a perilous issue. The part of that we miss is God doesn't suddenly get angry. Moses is suddenly more accountable. And we ourselves can have that happen, right? How often do people have their children confirmed or baptized who are in no state of soul to be doing so and feel like they're doing a good thing? And all you're doing is leading these poor kids to a greater level of accountability that they're not able to live up to. And you're damning your children when you do that. You're imposing upon them accountability that they're not going to keep. If your kid's not going to go to church, don't have them confirmed. Like, you're not doing any favors. Like, you have to be doing the things right, and the kid has to be correctly formed in order to enter into that deeper committed relationship with the church. You have to have your ducks in a row for that, or you're not doing any favors. This is like that, right? Elevated, escalated accountability brings additional consequences. And that can be a big deal. So Moses has this issue here of having greater accountability as a result of his closer relationship with God. So here we wrap it up. Moses has reconciled himself to his new lot. God calls Aaron, who goes and meets Moses. They get along famously, and then they catch up. Moses doesn't do the signs before the Israelites, but Aaron does. Moses has clearly passed those signs along to Aaron, along with speaking responsibility, and Aaron does the signs and says the things that Moses tells him to say, and the Israelites say, yep, we like this plan, the part where we get out of slavery and captivity here in Egypt and go have our own land. There's a lot, and this becomes important. There's a big chain of abstraction here between what the people are believing and where God is, right? It goes people, Aaron, Moses, God. And that's pretty far removed. The people are essentially believing Aaron, who's believing Moses, who's believing God. So when things get tough, and Moses and Aaron may have downplayed how bad it's going to get before it gets good, they may not have emphasized that part of things very much. The people don't have that faith in God that says, hey, yeah, this will be fine. They just are trusting Aaron, and that wears out fast when things turn bad, which they do quickly. So this arrangement, again, not optimal. It would have been challenging without Aaron in the middle. It would have been better. What we really need for this to work is for there to be a direct relationship between the people and God, which this covenant is not capable of affecting. This covenant that doesn't even exist yet, right? But this is the dynamic upon which that covenant is built. And it is not capable of affecting a direct relationship between the people and God. That comes later with Jesus. In this case, though, like we saw from a priesthood point of view, this structure is inherently flawed. Not only as it relates to what Aaron and his descendants are doing, but as it relates to the people as well, which we will see. But, you know, it's a start, and it's something to build on. And right now, the people are bought in. Moses and Aaron are brought in. Everybody is ready to go get to convincing Pharaoh that it's time to let the people go. This has been an overview of Lesson 4 of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, You Shall Have No Other Gods, the book of Exodus. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.